Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Papa Boris, and I've been making videos under the name Papa Boris for over half a decade now, but this is the first one I'm actually posting to my channel as a literal biological papa, and that explains why I haven't been posting a lot of videos lately, and don't get too excited, I'm not going to post any more for quite a while. It just happens to be Halloween here. My wife is out trick-or-treating with our stepson, the baby's asleep, and I got time to make a video. Who knows when I'll have time again, so I thought I'd do, in an homage, in honor of a perfect baby boy that I now have, we would cover a perfect game of chess. Now, for me, a perfect game of chess has three conditions. One, it should be short, because I have a short attention span. Two, it should be, featuring some kind of spectacular combination. And then three, neither player should make a mistake. Now, it's kind of tricky. How is it that a game can be short and one player makes a spectacular combination, yet the losing player didn't make a mistake? Well, if the combination is so spectacular that we could honestly pardon the losing player for not seeing it, and if the losing player and winning player make no other mistakes, then the game can satisfy all three conditions. So, let's go ahead and take a look at this one. Playing white was Efim Geller. Playing black was Lajos Portisch. The game was played in 1967. Geller was a known tactical wizard, and Portisch was a very strong positional player. His nickname was the Hungarian Botvinnik. So it was a clash of two, world caliber players. Geller kicked off with e4, and Portisch gave him e5. After this, you often get the Ruy Lopez, or the Spanish game. And here, Portisch played a6. This is known as the Morphy defense. And I can't remember if I've explained this before, but if I have, sorry, I'm going to explain it again. The idea behind this defense is that later on, if black decides he does not like this pin on his knight, he can play b5 and kick the bishop away. Whereas if you let the bishop stay here and continue developing, which, by the way, is totally fine, it's a very normal defense as well, then later on, if black decides he doesn't like this pin and he plays a6, white has the option to take the knight instead of retreating the bishop. Now, you might think, okay, well, then why not just take the knight now? Well, right now, taking the knight sucks. This basically gives up white's opening advantage, because after black takes on c6, this is a pretty equal position, and white's given up the bishop pair for more or less nothing. Note that there is no winning this pawn. Black can just, go here, and then after the knight moves, the e4 pawn falls. This is actually an advantage for black if you try to play like this. So anyway, Geller moves the bishop back to a4, and then we have knight to f6, white castles. It is possible to take this pawn here and lead to a sharp variation, but Portisch doesn't go for it. He just continues to develop normally with bishop to e7. White plays rook to e1, which protects this pawn, and also clears the f1 square. Oftentimes, the white pawn in the Ruy Lopez, as we'll see, ends up on c3, which blocks the knight from developing to that square, so the knight instead might make this maneuver from d2 to f1 and then either to e3 or to g3, where it might fight for the center or launch into an attack, or both. Here, Portisch decides to go for an early b5, which is totally fine. One idea behind this move is that later on, when white plays c3, the c2 square might be a good place to tuck away the bishop. If you go b5 first, then the bishop is forced to go to b3, which is also a fine place for it, but, on b3 it's not protecting this e4 pawn. Meanwhile, these two moves, a6 and b5, gave black some space on the queen side with tempo, and black can now also develop his light-squared bishop along this diagonal and put some pressure on the e4 pawn. So for the moment, black plays d6, strengthening his own e-pawn, and then white plays the move c3. This is a very classic Ruy Lopez theme. This game actually has quite a lot of classic themes in the Ruy Lopez. White will often play c3 and then go for d4, expanding in the center. Here, black castles, and white plays a prophylactic move, h3. This prevents any bishop changing its mind about b7 and coming in to pin the knight to the queen. It prevents the knight coming in here. And black says, hey, you know what? I can't put my stuff on g4. Well, you can't put your stuff on g5. Although it's worth noting that this pawn here ends up being very important to the outcome of this game. And so it's just one of those little things where, if you're watching a game carefully, seemingly innocent moves can have seemingly dramatic consequences. Well, okay, so how to proceed? White plays d4 to get the file open for this bishop and also get some space in the center. A good rule of thumb in chess, don't break the tension if you don't need to. There's no need for either player to break this tension, so they both just let it simmer. Black plays rook to e8. This gets ready to put the rook on the e-file and also let the bishop tuck away on f8, where it might provide some defense for the black king. Here, white begins this maneuver I was talking about, going to d2, then f1, and then e3 or g3. Meanwhile, black does his own maneuvering, putting the bishop on f8 and clearing the way for the rook to protect this e-pawn. After knight to f1, Portisch decided to go ahead and just put the bishop on b7, where it, exerted some pressure on this diagonal. Notice if this knight weren't here, then this pawn would actually be attacked twice. But white has knight to g3 protecting the pawn, so all is well. And here black plays queen to d7, a pretty normal move, right? This just connects the two rooks. Nothing wrong with that, right? Well, here Geller made a really interesting move. I think this is like the first key move of the game here. Geller played d takes e5. Now, I said earlier, and this is a principle I'm sure I've said in other videos too, you don't want to relieve the tension unless there's a reason for doing it. So what exactly is white's reason for relieving the tension? After d takes e5, the two queens are staring daggers at each other. And if white were to exchange queens, this is pretty much like offering a draw. It's kind of a weird situation in that the queens are the first pieces to come off the board. All the minor pieces, all the rooks are still here. But the pawn structure is totally symmetrical, and neither player has any advantage. This is most likely going to be a draw. If white avoids this by, say, going to e2 or something, then black for the moment has this d file, and white's really gained nothing from the exchange. So back here, before playing d takes e5, Geller actually calculated that after d takes e5, d takes e5, he would play this tricky move, knight to h5. And you don't get to this position and go, oh hey, I've got knight to h5. Like, you have to see it from back here, and it's tricky to see that kind of a move. It's a very unusual move, just sort of hanging the knight. If I were in this position playing white, I'd probably make some random dumb move like bishop to e3 or something, and then the game would end up being a draw or I'd lose. Right? It's in the genius of players of Geller's caliber to see little things. So anyway, what's going on with knight to h5? Well, this takes advantage of the weakness of black's last move, believe it or not. The queen may look toasty on d7, but back on d8, it was protected by both rooks, whereas on d7, it's protected only by this knight. So the move knight to h5, in a sense, is a deflection of black's knight, because if black takes the knight, then of course the queen hangs and white grabs it. Okay, well, black doesn't have to take the knight, so what does this accomplish? Well, if black plays queen takes d1, white doesn't have to recapture the queen. White can play knight takes f6, which is a move with check. And now, after the knight is recaptured and white recaptures the queen, either with the bishop, or I guess the engine likes the bishop. I would probably do the rook just because that seems more natural. But anyway, the queen is recaptured, and now it may seem very similar to the previous situation, but this change in the pawn structure makes all the difference. And between two Grandmaster World Caliber players, this would be enough of an advantage for white to win the game, most likely. Because now this pawn on h6 is weak, these pawns are doubled, and this f5 square could be very strong for white. It's subtle advantages for mere mortals the likes of you and me, but a grandmaster against another grandmaster would never allow this to happen. Interestingly, according to the engine, queen takes d1 was black's best move, even though it leads to such a disadvantageous endgame. But it makes perfect sense that Portisch wouldn't play that way because, yeah, the knight on h5 is annoying, but I mean, going into what is almost certainly going to be a long grind to a loss is not the way that you win at chess. So Portisch played queen to e7, ducking aside from white's attack. And now white plays knight to h4, so here Geller again shows his genius. The old saying in chess is knights on the rim are dim, and Geller's got two of them, but they're quite good here. He's threatening to come to f5, this one's maybe eyeing f6 or maybe g7 in some cases. So these knights are really putting the pressure on the black king. So Portisch makes a reasonable move. He plays knight takes h5, getting rid of one of white's attackers, and after white takes on h5, Portisch plays knight to a5. Now this is the key moment in the position, because when you're just a patzer like me looking at this in an engine, it's very easy to be like, oh wow, the evaluation shifts from plus 0.6 to plus 6.5, ho, Portisch blundered. But I think that would be a very misleading way to analyze the situation. The engine says that black needed to play knight to d8 to protect this f7 pawn. And maybe that's true, but all of black's pieces are in the second row, white's got a wide open position, and all of the activity and every advantage. So it seems like it's just a very passive way to play. Meanwhile, knight to a5 gets this bishop off of the sensitive light diagonal and is a much more proactive move. It allows for black to maybe push c5, get some counterplay on the queen side. Now, if you're a schmo like me, when someone plays bishop to h6, you're like, whoa, holy cow, I never saw that coming. But Portisch, I would stake $1,000. he knew that this was a possibility. You're up against FM Geller, you got an h6 pawn up here, and a couple of white queeses bearing down on your king. You're thinking about this possibility every time. And I would stake more than $1,000 that Portisch calculated this very carefully and thought about what would happen after he refuted the combination with knight takes b3. So what exactly does white do in this situation? How does white proceed with the attack? If white just takes the knight, then black can simply take the bishop. The black bishop is protecting h6, and the white pieces can't really launch an aggressive fast enough. White is just down a piece and will lose the game. How else can white proceed? White can try to sack on g7, but after the bishop recaptures again, there's no real way to continue the attack. White has nothing better than to just take the knight, and white's down a piece and will lose the game. If white tries something fancy like bishop to g5, for example, which requires very careful calculation, the queen is attacked, and now if the queen moves, white can recapture the knight, and this bishop never got taken, but it did eliminate this h6 pawn. White has the advantage. So Portisch would have had to probably calculate and think that maybe after g6, he'd be okay. See, now if white takes black's queen, then black takes white's queen, and if white takes black's bishop, then black's knight takes the rook. And after the bishop runs, then the knight can run. And then the knight is trapped. Okay, but after the smoke has cleared, black here would be up the exchange and would win the game. So I'm not showing you every single possible variation, but there's a lot that you have to do to play knight to a5. It is a move that, yeah, maybe it technically loses the game, but it's a move that requires great skill to play because you have to calculate a lot of stuff with this bishop to h6 sacrifice and what happens if black ignores it and plays knight takes b3. You know, it's one of those things where certain players in chess history have a reputation for being attacking players and certain players have a reputation for being defensive players, but the lines are very blurry. When you look at games that attacking players win, they had the positional advantage going into the attack. Like Geller established here with this neat taking on e5 and the knight to h5 trick from a few moves ago. And conversely, defensive players need to be good attackers because they have to foresee possible combinations and how to refute them, which is the exact same thing that attackers do to win. I don't think knight to a5 was a mistake because Portisch had to do a lot of calculation to play this move. I think the only mistake that Portisch made in this game was sitting down to play a game of chess against FM Geller, because FM Geller here actually played bishop to g5. I mean, how do you even think of this move? Like, I could stare at this position for an hour and the move bishop to g5 would not even, like, occur to me. I wouldn't even, like, think to maybe make that move. So how are we supposed to fault Lajos Portisch from back here for not seeing the potential of this move? Like, it's actually harder to find the combination from here as black than it is to find it from here as white. But anyway, let's see what the hell's going on. This is one of my favorite types of combinations. It's very dazzling, although somewhat subtle. It's not, you know, sacking a queen for a pawn, but it's hanging a bishop. And these types of hanging combinations are so appealing to me because, again, I never consider them. And black's not, like, forced to take the piece. There has not been a capture, so there is no force to recapture. But yet, in a certain situation, the combination can be very damning. So let's take a look at what's happening. First of all, can this bishop be taken? Well, if black takes the bishop with the pawn, and that opens up the queen's look at h8, white can play knight to g6, and there's actually no stopping queen to h8 checkmate. This bishop, which was going to be eliminated in one move's time, has survived for just one move long enough. It's pinning this f7 pawn, so it cannot recapture, or cannot capture, white's knight. If black takes the bishop with the queen, then the f7 pawn is hanging, and then white can play this, and checkmate on g8. It actually all worked out horribly for black. The rook that on f8 would have been protecting the pawn has moved to e8, and then the rooks that would have been protecting g8 have been blocked by this bishop that got put to f8. Not that this is a bad maneuver, but it just happened to work out very badly for black in this case, and of course, to top it off, the g6 flight square for the black king is covered by white's knight. So the bishop can't be taken. That means that black needs to move his queen because the queen is attacked. However, as we just saw, the f7 square must be protected or else it leads to checkmate, and the only place black can put the queen and still protect f7 is d7. All well and good. So now, Geller played rook a to d1, attacking the queen further. There's no place anymore that black can put this queen where it's not under attack and it is protecting the f7 pawn. This e8 square is tragically covered by black's own rook, so there's no place that black can go. So black has to play bishop to d6, which Portisch did. And the engine is just desperate here. I mean, the engine here is saying that black has to make crazy moves, like rook to e7 and give up the queen. But Portisch made a normal human move, bishop to d6. And now Geller played bishop takes h6. So this whole thing of bishop to g5, this dazzling, bizarre hanging move, it wasn't really about deflecting the queen from its protection of f7. What it was really about was deflecting the bishop from its x-rayed protection of h6, so that then Geller could sacrifice the bishop on h6. I mean, wow. So now, how to defend? Well, before we were looking at the possibility of ignoring the bishop and playing knight takes b3 to finally get rid of this menacing white bishop that's pinning the pawn. The problem is that with this bishop gone from f8, white can now play bishop takes g7 with impunity and win the game. I'm not going to show every single variation. A lot of them are, kind of similar variations on the same theme, but I want to show you the two main reasons why this is a winning combination. So first of all, white is threatening queen to h8 checkmate, so black has to do something. The obvious, of course, would be just to take the bishop. In this position, white can play queen to g5 check, and black's king is hard up for options. If he tries to go to h7, then white plays knight to f5, and there's no way to stop checkmate here. If black tries to block the checkmate on g7 like this, white checkmates on h6. If black tries to stock checkmate with the bishop, then white wins the queen and mate follows. So the only way that black can actually stop the checkmate is to play queen takes f5. And now white has won the queen. Technically, black does have 3 minor pieces for the queen, but one of the pieces is currently hanging, and if it moves, then white has a devastating attack that just can't be stopped. White will play f6, and now there's just no way for black to either get checkmated or lose a whole metric butt-ton of material trying to stop checkmate from happening. So that's what happens if black were to take this bishop. The only other way that black can try to defend this is by pushing this pawn up to f6 or f5. Again, I'm not going to show every variation. They're all kind of similar. But if black goes, let's say, f6, then white plays check. And then the key thing I want to show you is that there's this move now when white's queen is attacked, queen to h7. And so what happens here is that the black king is under heavy fire from a lot of pretty strong white pieces. Also, black's queen is hanging, and there's no way for black to both save his king and protect the queen. So let's just say that black tries to run like this. White would play bishop takes f6 check, preventing the escape. If the king takes the bishop, then your queen's gone and you lose. If you try to hang on to the queen by playing king to e6, then white can play queen to f5 check. And once again, your queen is gone because there's nothing you can do to stop it. So that's the recurring theme in all of these variations. When black pushes a pawn to try to leave a flight square for the king on f7, white gives check, goes to h7, and then black either drops the queen or the king, or both in some cases. So Portisch decided not to play knight takes b3, although knight takes b3 was technically the best move in the sense that it would have dragged the game out the longest. Black is completely lost here either way, but Portisch basically threw in the towel. He just took the bishop on h6, and this definitely loses in the fastest way possible. So after g takes h6, Geller simply went to queen g... Well, I shouldn't call this simply. Geller played queen to g6 check. And the thing is that this bishop, which has hung on for just one move, is one move enough to block this f7 pawn. And now black's king is in serious trouble. If he goes to h8, then white will simply play queen takes h6 check, king to g8, and now that this pin is in effect once more, white's got this move, knight g6, we saw something similar, and there's no way to stop queen to h8 checkmate, because this pawn cannot move. If black plays queen to f8, which Portisch did, then white has queen to f6. And now black is again in trouble. This pawn is now pinned by the queen, enabling again this common theme of the knight coming to g6, and then threatening an unstoppable checkmate on h8. So the only thing that black can do is to go to g8, but the problem now is that black promptly loses. The technical fastest way to win here would be to play knight to f5, and there's no way to stop this checkmate on g7 without giving up the queen, either by moving the bishop, and then letting the rook take the queen, or by having the queen sack itself against the knight. But Geller didn't play this move. He played rook to e3, which does win more slowly. It is a forced mate in 10 moves instead of a forced mate in like what was it, 7 if the knight moves, but this was good enough to make black resign, because now the rook is simply threatening to move over to this g-file and just cut the black king off and checkmate with the queen on g7. The best defense here would have been to play bishop takes e4, and there's a couple different ways that white can respond to this. One way is just to take the bishop, even though this gives up the forced mate. I mean, at this point, white has a devastating attack against the king. There's no way to stop the rook from coming over here, and black would basically have to lose his queen. Technically, if you want to win in the most precise way, white could play queen takes h6, threatening rook to g3, and the black king is totally cut off. Black has to start giving up pieces in bizarre ways, like playing queen to g4, just to delay the inevitable checkmate. So, rook to e3 was more than good enough for black to resign, which in this case, Portisch did. Thank you so much for watching this video. I hope that you enjoyed it. Please like and or subscribe if you did. And I hope to see you again soon, but I probably won't. It'll probably be a while before I make another video. Now, at this point, if you'll allow me, I'm going to launch into a bit of self-indulgent philosophizing, because in this video, in this game, I should say, it was really amazing how everything seemed to work out for white and nothing seemed to work out for black. It's like a saying I heard once many years ago when I was at a chess camp. A grandmaster there said, a master thinks for a long time and finds the best square for a piece. A grandmaster throws all the pieces in the air and they land on the best squares. And it kind of seemed to be that way in this game. So just for a little bit of my own self-indulgence, let me show you some of the things that happen in this game and how they seem to work out so much better for white than for black. So if we go back to the opening, right, black pushed white's bishop to b3, where it ended up being extremely devastating, pinning this f7 pawn and a whole bunch of key variations. Black also ended up putting this bishop on b7. Had the bishop stayed on c8, it could have gone to e6 at some point and maybe intercepted white's bishop. But instead the bishop was on b7, as we see here, and it was unable, therefore, to block white's key bishop. Both black and white did some basic Ruy Lopez maneuvers. White did the whole c4 to d4 thing, which ended up being crucial when the pawn exchanged itself on e5, allowing the white knight to come to h5. White did this maneuver with the knight to g3, which was obviously very crucial, letting the knight come to h5. Whereas black's maneuvers didn't seem to work out very well. Black did the whole rook to e8 thing and the bishop to f8 thing, both of which ended up allowing white to checkmate black in some variations and get the whole party started. Like we already talked about, black put the bishop on b7, which was bad for black, and black's losing move, knight to a5, which was normally a totally fine move in the Ruy Lopez, was the move that precipitated this incredible combination from Geller, bishop to g5. So it's like all the normal things that black did worked against him, and all of the normal things that white did were perfectly essential for the combination that won the game. And that is all part of why I consider this to be one of the few perfect games of chess ever played. Thanks again for watching. I'll hope to see you again soon, but if not, then I hope to see you when I can